Hi, I'm Rachel Ann Goodman, journalism instructor for Cabrillo College. And every semester, my students pick a different topic that they want to share with you, things that affect their lives personally. And today, they're going to be talking about Santa Cruz County's housing crisis. Here is your moderator, Ventana Magallanes.
Thank you, Rachel. Santa Cruz is known as one of the least affordable cities in the United States. It hasn't always been so high priced, though, and such a rise in the real estate value without an income increase to match has had notable effects on the local community. Without enough affordable housing and limited space available to build new housing, what can longtime residents do to avoid being priced out? Is rent control a possible solution, or could it add tensions between landlords and residents? Hello, I'm Ventana Magallanes, and joining me today are Mo Anderson, Maddie Ramirez, Brigitte Reardon, Danny White, and Ricardo Monroy. Mo, why don't you start us off? What do you think is the cause of the housing crisis?
Well, Ventana, I think gentrification is definitely one of the most problems that comes up with the housing crisis in Santa Cruz, just because a lot of the lower class is exploited, and where they're living, a lot of upper class people want to live, so the prices are jacked up way high. So I think that's probably one of the most problems.
What about you, Maddie?
I think there's a lot to it. One thing is there's funds being cut, so there's not enough housing, and it's because of the funds being cut.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What about you, Brigitte? What do you think could be a possible cause of the housing crisis?
I would say overpopulation, very much so. This is a beautiful place. It's a tourist attraction. We live near the booming Silicon Valley tech industry, a big retirement community, 2 colleges. So I think it's just overpopulation is a big factor.
Definitely. What about you, Danny?
Yeah, there's a lot of contributing factors to that. They already touched on a few of them: gentrification, overpopulation. This is a very desirable place to live or to come visit. There's a lot of Airbnbs, so that's taking up a lot of available housing. There's just so many factors that play.
The University of California, Santa Cruz is the students who decide to go there, are winning. They get to go to a great university in California, right next to the beach. A lot of attractions here going on, and but the cons of that, the rent, having to live in dorms and such is really high. For incoming students who are expected to be, full time, working. Have to go to school, then have to also work, to be able to pay off the rent. So that's a big crisis, that's going on for them.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And rent control has been a hot debate here in Santa Cruz since it's going to be on the ballot coming up on June 5th. And Cynthia Greger, a proponent of rent control, was kind enough to explain what the legislation could entail and what some possible benefits could be of rent control. So why don't we cue that video now?
Now that there's a huge boom in California, especially Northern California, but also LA, it's just exacerbated. So there's not enough housing, and there's no possible way for there enough housing to be built unless there were to be a huge amount of money pumped into it that no one private company could do, and no group of private companies could do, and even the government couldn't do it. And so, that's one of the main reasons. But there's a cause for that, and that is that our housing is left to the private market. And in countries where it's not, they don't have as bad of a housing crisis. It's kind of complicated because there's 2 issues right now. There's the fact that rent control is artificially constrained by the Costa-Hawkins Act, which was passed in 1995 in California, and that limits the amount of housing that can be covered by rent control, both by date and by type of unit. And so that limits how many people can be affected directly by a cap on their rents. But for the people who can be affected directly, what that does is it says, like, for example, the city of Santa Cruz has a temporary rent freeze, and as long as that's in effect, the rents can't go up more than 2% once a year. Well, that helps people to budget. People here are already paying well over, from 50 to who knows how much, extreme amounts of their income towards just simply remaining housed. So at least the least that can happen is to make them be able to budget for a year and know that, and not to be constantly moving from one community to another, and you don't have a regular doctor, you don't have any friends because you have to move, you don't have that means you may not know the local landlords that could help you, like if you were in your home community, that could help you to afford a place. And so your entire life network is unstable, and that goes for the rest of the community. Like you can't find people to work in your business if you're a small business person, or if you're a large business person also. If we had rent control, there would be more stability, important stability in the life of the entire community. There would be more stability for everyone. Well, I think it's the only tool in the housing toolkit that can help some tenants overnight and after an election. And that's a fact. There's nothing else that can help some tenants right now except rent control. And I'd rather fight for some tenants. And it's not about which people, it's about which buildings. So the more buildings that we can get covered, the better. Right now I spoke to a woman with a family, parents, grandparents, children. They have gotten a rent raise of $400, and then they got one at $600 in the same year.
Wow.
And that sends a message that you're not wanted here. And so women, people of color, and older people on fixed incomes, and disabled people are being cleansed out at Santa Cruz. And I think that rent control is the only thing that can help a few of those people and keep a little bit of diversity in the city.
I'd like to briefly correct myself. That was Cynthia Berger. I misread her name earlier. So, Brigitte, what might some other benefits or consequences of the rent control ordinance be? Like, what might some opponents have to say?
Well, as Cynthia mentioned, there's a lot of benefits to rent control. Tenants will have rights, a sense of security, affordable homes. Some of the perceived negatives would be that property owners would no longer have the flexibility to move into their own homes if they were renting them out. If they were to break a lease, they would be responsible to pay a relocation fee for 6 months.
Wow, that's a long time.
Yeah, six months of rent in Santa Cruz is a good between $10,000 to $20,000, more or less, depending on the cost of the rental. So tenants may be given rights, but that also means that rights are taken away from the property owners. Some feel that rent control is a temporary relief for a bigger issue in Santa Cruz being a lack of space. And some suggest that a solution to that would be to build more homes and affordable housing. However, that also weighs on the environment and our community's identity. So there's a lot of factors to take into account to determine whether or not rent control is a solution.
And you were talking about affordable housing. Maddie, do you have anything to add about that?
Yeah. You mentioned building more houses, and there's a problem. There's not enough houses being built for the amount of people that want to live here. We're, like you guys had mentioned earlier, we're overpopulated. And a lot of people blame Prop 13 for this. And if you guys don't know what Prop 13 is, it was passed in the 70s, I believe. And it protects you from paying a lot of property taxes. So if you buy a house for $500,000, you pay 1.1% of that. And if your house rate goes up, you still pay the amount of property taxes you were paying when you first bought your house. Now, this helps people who bought houses back then, because obviously the house rate wasn't as high as it is now. And obviously they're still paying a little bit of property taxes. But those funds go to schools, roads, and building houses. And because those funds are being cut, not enough houses are being built. And that's a major issue.
Very interesting. So we went around the Cabrillo campus and downtown, and we interviewed other students to see how they feel about rent control. And we have a video of them answering some questions that we asked them. I think we'd like to go to that video now.
I guess I can see both sides of it, because on the one hand, people need to pay their mortgages, so they kind of have to charge the price of what they bought the house for. Like, I live sort of in a separate house connected to the house of some other people, and I know they struggle every month to get by. So I understand they need to charge a lot, but at the same time, I think there are a lot of people who are just sort of taking advantage of the housing prices to make lots of money.
I can see both sides as well. I think rent control is probably a good idea. A lot of people, if they have the choice, they'll try to make a profit off of whatever business they're doing. If their business is housing or landlord or renting things out to people, they'll probably up it up. I mean, they'll probably one-up it. So I think especially for people who, they work on a limited budget, they can't afford to find somewhere else, then I think rent control is a good idea.
We live in a really darn expensive area, so I do like the idea of it not being super high.
So it's like income inequality is affecting the housing situation. It's also supply and demand. They aren't building a lot more houses. And third, I do think that the growth of the university is driving some of this, that all the renting is being taken up by students who need a place to stay, and they're willing to put 4 people in a room.
The place is attractive. There are good jobs nearby. It's beautiful. And there's a strong push to try to keep it an intimate small city. So there's a crunch in terms of refusing to grant permits and do much more building.
Lack of housing, too many people. I mean, generally, there's a population boom, but just expensive housing, I think there's a lot of factors. I mean, obviously Silicon Valley probably plays into that, and just because this area is pretty, people want to live here, so the prices can just go up.
I have a friend who she's going to Cabrillo, and she ended up living in this warehouse that was illegally converted into a housing area. There was no insulation or anything like that. She was living in this loft, and she wasn't even on the lease, but it was affordable, so she took it.
I know a lot of people that'll live in student housing where you're only allowed to have 1 person per room, but then they bring in an extra bed and rent it out to someone else just to make ends meet.
I'm struggling to move out, saving up money like that, because I'm taking on bills now that my parents are pushing off onto me. So saving up to move out, to be prepared to pay rent in California.
I lived in my car for 6 months. It was awesome.
Can you expand on that?
Oh, it was great. Didn't have to pay rent. But with that, I also lived in a living room for $550 a month downtown. I know. With no room, just kind of like a living room with a futon mattress on the floor.
So it sounds like we've heard a lot of, extreme situations from other students. Have you guys ever experienced an extreme housing situation, or, struggled to make rent before, or know anyone who has? Well?
Yeah, last year actually I had to move out of my place because my landlord is only for the school year. So we had to sublet somewhere for the summer, and it was kind of a last minute rush deal, so I couldn't really look into the place we were staying. Mm-hmm. So once we got there, it wasn't a great situation. The bathroom was super dirty, and the kitchen was super dirty, and it was actually a 3-story house, so each floor kind of had their own bathroom. But yeah, so it was kind of the landlord didn't really care what condition the house was really in, or what conditions the people were living in. So we kind of take it upon ourselves to, I guess, do a cleaning day of just making everything where it's actually able to live in. Yeah.
So would you have lived in that situation if you weren't, in such a rush,
no,
or
no. I would have looked for somewhere way
something
better, or just anywhere else, or even out of Santa Cruz, because it's not okay.
What about you, Maddie?
Yeah, I have a coworker who works 2 jobs. She works at Kmart in the morning, and then she works at Orchard at night, and she lives in her car. she recently bought a new car and she got so excited because that's her new home. That's what she calls it, her new home. And she has to rent out a hotel room once or twice a week. And she can't afford to live in anywhere. She's tried, and the longest she's lived at a house was about 3 months because they just hit her with like a $200 raise in rent, and like she couldn't afford it. I also have friends who were begging me to move in with them and 7 other people in this house and with one bathroom, and I was not going to do that because I still had to pay $700 even though there was 7 other people living there, and I was not going to do that for that amount of money, you know. So it's crazy how expensive it is.
How many people to a room would that be?
I mean, it's a old house, so it's pretty big. It's a 2-story, but they basically cut big rooms into 2 separate rooms. So it's like literally a small space. There's
So it's
like
living in an office.
Yeah, it's terrible. It's bad.
Brigitte, what about you? Have you ever experienced or know anyone who's experienced an extreme housing situation?
Yeah, I would say half people I know in Santa Cruz have at one point lived in their car, rent a closet, rent a couch for close to $500. 6 people to a 2-bedroom.
Wow.
Really questionable living situations. And I myself, I had struggled to make my rent when I was injured and I had to get surgery. I couldn't work for a month or so.
How stressful.
Yeah, it was very stressful, and on top of that, hospital bills hit you and other bills and your rent, and of course the price of the rent doesn't help. Yeah, it's definitely an issue.
Danny, what about you?
Yeah, I'm actually in the process of moving right now. What I'm going to do after this is move more stuff into my new place. And my previous place was kind of decrepit, falling apart, so I really needed to get out. But as I was looking through all the lists on Craigslist and all the ads and everything, I realized that it was going to be a lot more expensive to live anywhere else. Like a $400 increase from my old house to my new house. Wow. If I didn't have someone to share a bed with, or if I wasn't willing to share a bed with someone, then I wouldn't be able to afford the place that I'm about to be living in.
And you're sharing a bed with someone. Is this a Craigslist thing?
It's actually just my girlfriend. Thank God. Yeah, it's not some weird guy or anything like that. But yeah, if I wasn't willing to share a bed with my girlfriend, then I would be out of luck. I would not be able to afford it at all.
Well, you're lucky you have your girlfriend.
I am very lucky, yeah.
What about you, Ricardo?
Yeah, I have a sister who has 3 kids, and about 2 years ago was evicted from her apartment for being late on rent, and so that was very tough on her. You know, she had to move in with us because she had nowhere else. She couldn't afford staying in a hotel multiple times a week and such. So my parents let her come stay at home, pay rent there and stuff, and it's been going on for like 2 years now. She's still living with us at home and such, and me, I personally pay rent at home, pay my father around $500 a month to stay in the room that I've lived in my whole life. Wow. It's weird,
That's strange.
But
I mean, just to like grow up in your room and then have to start paying rent for it.
Yeah. But it's understandable.
Yeah.
I need to help out at home. And so it's
Definitely. And so, like, hearing about the living situations of people living like a bunch of people to a room, it kind of makes me think about the landlord's responsibility, in terms of like the living situations for these people. Because, like you said, Mo, you moved into like this really dirty, decrepit place that you probably wouldn't have moved into under normal circumstances. But I mean, finding a place is so rare, especially one that you can afford. That desperation just kind of forces you to just hurry up and do it.
Yeah.
And so, does anyone think that maybe like limiting vacation rentals or Airbnbs might be a possible help or solution? Anyone?
I think it could possibly help. I checked Airbnb the other night, and there are 967 listings in Santa Cruz. 65% of those are private homes or apartments. So that's 631 places that people have empty for the most part, where they just rent it out temporarily for Airbnb. And I can understand that, I guess, if you have a mortgage to pay, and Airbnb might be more lucrative than renting out your place for long term. So I can understand that, but then again, we're losing 631 places available that could house 600 families and more,
That's pretty frustrating. Anyone else have anything to add?
I think that takes away from, the community. People living here are wanting to give back to the community, the shops, the stores, and it affects more than just the tenants, that need homes, as well as the other businesses around town.
Definitely.
To keep everything afloat.
I agree.
No, yeah, I totally agree with that. Again, with Prop 13, it's made development decisions more complicated. Like, if there's an empty lot, cities would more likely open up a Target or a hotel because they need the money rather than just an apartment. That also falls with the whole Prop 13 thing and falls into the not enough housing again. And it's, that's what cities do. They depend on Target and big, big corporations. So yeah, it's sad.
So Danny, can you tell us about how the price of rent in Santa Cruz compares to the price of rent in surrounding areas?
Yeah, definitely. So average rent in Santa Cruz, that's ranging from studio to 3-bedroom place, is $2,339 a month. If you compare that to Watsonville, their rent average for studio to 3-bedroom is $1,500 a month, but that's with a 16% increase from last year. So the surrounding areas are also feeling the heat too. Everything's kind of going up. I do know that if you compared that to if you wanted to move kind of up north into the valley, average rent in Sacramento is a lot cheaper. It's only about, $1,500 to $2,000, which is a lot cheaper than Santa Cruz. But then again, that's what we're paying for to live here. Like, you got the mountains, the ocean, great community, a lot of stuff happening. It's a very desirable place. And if you put that into perspective about how much an average person made a year, let's say you're a starting out teacher at an elementary school, you might make $51,000 starting out. You're going to be paying about $32,000 a year in rent. So that doesn't leave a lot for the other stuff, like food or bills, hospital bills, savings, if you want to go on vacation, So it's pretty hard, and especially for like a lot of students that might be in the service industry, because I know I myself am. And if you're a service industry employee, you make anywhere from like $19,000 to $30,000 a year, depending on your tips, and depending on the busy season. Like in the summertime, I feel rich. I feel really good. And then in November and December, when the tourists don't really come that often, I start making less money, and it's like pinching to get by and squeezing. Yeah. Santa Cruz is very expensive.
Very expensive. Sometimes it makes me worry because, does anyone here know anyone who's been priced out of Santa Cruz? Or like potentially? Because I grew up in Monterey, and I always think about like, will I be able to come back here in the future and, either, make a life for myself here or, enjoy living in my hometown when I'm older? Because sometimes that seems like a reality that may not happen. Yeah. Does anyone else feel the same way?
Yeah, I have an uncle who used to live in Watsonville, and when he was old enough to move out, he couldn't find anywhere to live. So he now lives in Arizona. He owns this big 2-story house, and it's like 3 times as big as my house, but he's paying a lot less for it because it's in Arizona. And so I'm thinking, I'm thinking when I'm older, am I gonna have to move to Arizona or something? Because it's a lot cheaper, and his house is super nice. So,
yeah.
He had to leave.
Yeah, so there's a lot of sad, well, not sadness, but it's really hard dealing with a housing crisis, and especially with a lot of incoming students, coming for Santa Cruz. So do you know, like, how do they intend to, like, make any expansions briefly?
Currently, planning on building more complexes for the students. Currently, the admissions, working more and more on, the wanting to build more buildings, for students, to live there and stuff. But it's going to be really hard, to pay for all that rent. That's going to be really expensive. When you think about it, being a student itself is pretty difficult, because when you pay for rent, that doesn't include all the other utilities they have to buy. For example, like textbooks. Textbooks are not cheap themselves. They're very expensive. Having to buy things for yourself also, like personal items, that's a lot of money that goes into it. And so, being a student, isn't that easy at UCSC. I've seen pictures where students like to live in the forest in tents, near campus, because it gets that extreme and that tough. So it's not easy on not easy on those students and stuff.
It's difficult for a lot of students. I mean, I personally don't think I would be able to live in my car and focus on my studies at the same time. I admire the people who can, for sure. So dealing with a housing shortage is no easy task, and the stakes are high, as no one wants to be priced out of their homes. And today I hope that we left you with a better understanding of what could be the possible causes of the housing crisis and some possible solutions. So what do you think could ease the housing crisis? To voice your opinion, you can write a letter to the editor of the Santa Cruz Sentinel. And don't forget to vote on June 5th in regards to the rent control ordinance. Thank you. I'm Ventana Magallanes. Here with me is Mo Anderson, Maddie Ramirez, Brigitte Reardon, Danny White, and Ricardo Monroy. Thank you.